Donkey Kong is no doubt a legend. He introduced the world to Mario back in 1981 and continues to be a video game icon to this day. Recently, he got a new redesign. Some people don't like it. I think it's all right. To each their own. And he got a new game for the Nintendo Switch 2, Donkey Kong Bonanza. I haven't played it yet. Eventually, I'll get around to it. But yeah, I remember playing the OG Donkey Kong in the arcade back in the day. But like I say all the time, it was magical when we got arcade games at home, like ports. And I remember having a lot of fun playing Donkey Kong on the NES back in the late 80s. But that wasn't the first time I played it. The home port. The first home console I had wasn't the NES, it was the Atari 2600. And I do remember there being Nintendo games for it, including Donkey Kong. My God, I played some of those games back then. But recently I've been getting into the 7800, which I never had back then. I know there were ports of some of the Donkey Kong games for it, and I figure they have to have been a heck of a lot better than the 2600 versions. So I went out and bought me some brand new copies of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. for the 7800 to compare to the NES versions. But before we jump into the comparison of these games, I always find it interesting all the courtroom and legal drama that was going on back in the day concerning all this. Atari, Donkey Kong. So if you rewind back to 1982, Donkey Kong in the arcades was exploding, right? Making tons of money. And Universal Studios, they were catching wind of that. They were like, hey, this is King Kong. So they sued Nintendo for trademark copyright infringement. That lawsuit went on for some time, just a little quick history lesson here. But Nintendo, they eventually won. Their licensing partners at that time, they were being affected by it as well. There were cease and desists. They were being charged royalties and stuff, demanded royalties by Universal. But it was kind of funny, ironically, when this was going on, Universal, they actually licensed their own King Kong game to Tiger Vision, which wound up being a blatant ripoff of Donkey Kong. But yeah, in the end, Nintendo won. Universal, they didn't have the exclusive rights to a giant gorilla. And that was it. They had to pay their profits they made from King Kong and other damages to Nintendo. So it was kind of interesting. But then there was even more drama that you may recall in the late 80s that kind of brings this full circle. After the game crash in the 80s, Nintendo, they were becoming big with the NES dominating. Yet they were making like these licensing deals for their arcade games for other consoles to make like easy, royalties, like Donkey Kong on the 7800, which is what we're talking about today. Now, during this time, Atari Games had their Tengen subsidiary, which they were suing Nintendo for antitrust policies or practices and, their iron fist control over the NES ecosystem with their lockout chip and other things, right? The lawsuit was initially filed in 1988, which is the same year Donkey Kong Jr. was released on the 7800. So if you remember Tengen, they were releasing those black, unlicensed NES cartridges. Nintendo, they weren't happy about it, so they accused them of reverse engineering the lockout chip, which they did, obviously. And eventually the courts did side with Nintendo mostly, and that was in 1992. In 1994, Atari and Nintendo, they settled all the litigation, agreed to dismiss all these claims. And Nintendo, they received unspecified payment and patent licenses from Atari. And Atari Games would become a Nintendo licensee. So I guess it all worked out. I just found this fascinating. So, I look at these 7800 carts as weird little artifacts from that era. Nintendo games released on an Atari system smack in the middle of console wars and legal battles. Just goes to show you how tangled the industry was back then. A little weird little history lesson out of the way. Let's get to the games, unbox these physical copies for the NES 7800, compare them. Even take a little look at some of those earlier Atari ports for reference, how much better these 7800 versions may have been. Let's do it. So first up, the NES version. So I've got this complete in-box copy of Donkey Kong Classics, which bundles both Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. on one cartridge. So this double pack released in 1988. Same year as those 7800 versions, right? But the individual versions of the games, they released on cart a couple years earlier on the NES. But I love the look of this box, more so than the original versions. You got Donkey Kong holding Donkey Kong Jr., Mario bashing Donkey Kong in the head with a hammer. Definitely a unique look. So let's pop this card into the NES and boot up Donkey Kong first. So this is a pretty faithful port to the arcade, but with one big caveat. It only has 3 levels instead of the arcade's 4. You get the barrel stage, the elevators, and the rivets. but no Pie Factory. It was cut out for whatever reason. Who knows? I mean, I think it could have fit. They just didn't make it fit. The graphics, though, in the game look crisp for the era. The colors are vibrant, animation's smooth. Jumpman, Mario, whatever you want to call him, controls fine. Jumping feels precise. The sound effects got those classic bleeps and bloops going that capture, the arcade vibe. But let's go ahead and switch on over to Donkey Kong Jr. real quick on the NES, obviously. So this port nails all 4 arcade levels. You got the vines, the springboards, that spark stage, I don't know what you call it, and the chain stage where you push up the keys to save, Papa Kong, Donkey Kong. So obviously here, you're playing as Junior instead of Jumpman or Mario. Swinging on vines, dodging snapjaws and birds. The NES version shines with detailed sprites and animations. The music loop is catchy without being annoying. Controls are fairly tight in my opinion. Very competent port for sure. I've had a lot of fun playing this version of the game. So that's the Nintendo home console port side. That's it. So let's go ahead and see what's done over on the Atari side on the more capable 7800 system. So I do remember those 2600 ports. They were nowhere near as good as the NES versions. So I'd have to have hope for the 7800 versions. Now, I got both games for the 7800 sealed. I'm not worried about keeping them that way. For me, games are meant to be played, so that's why I bought them, to unseal them and play them. So, yeah, let's unbox them. So starting with Donkey Kong on the 7800, just like the NES version, this port has only 3 levels, missing that Pie Factory again. Now this game, it's actually based on the NES code rather than like a fresh port or whatever. Now graphics-wise, it is a bit rougher for sure. The colors are more muted, the sprite's a bit blockier. Overall, the game seems to lack a little bit of detail compared to the NES version. But, the 7800 hardware could actually handle higher resolutions, so there's a little less flicker in some scenes, so that's a plus. Now, sound definitely is where the game takes a hit. 7800 uses the old TIA chip from the 2600, so the effects are harsher and less melodic than the NES. Just not as smooth sounding. It's more beepy. Now, the gameplay is fairly solid, though. It doesn't quite pop as well as the NES version, but there really isn't too much to complain about, I would say. But gotta be real, the 2600 version, which was the only version I played before any of these back in the day, was hilariously basic with only 2 levels. Had chunky graphics and a lot of flicker. So for Atari fans, hey, this 7800 port was a huge upgrade. It actually feels like a proper game if all you had was that 2600 port, right? So now let's move on to Donkey Kong Jr. for the 7800. Again, you get all 4 levels here, just like the NES version. Now graphics, similar story, decent, but a little downgraded, not crazy, but Junior looks a little squished, vines are a little simpler, enemies like the birds have less animation frames, and the sound, the same thing with the TI, the TIA limitations as Donkey Kong, scratchy effects that don't quite match the arcade's charm. But again, if you've seen the 2600 version of Donkey Kong Jr., which was crazy rough with like flickering sprites, really simple levels that barely resembled the arcade, and sound effects that were just noise, they weren't really like effects, the 7800 version really shines in comparison. So after having played these versions for the past few weeks, like I've been playing them quite a bit, I have to say they're definitely charming, and I'm glad I bought them. But there's no denying that NES versions win in most categories. I still think the 7800 versions are fun, and if I had them back in the 80s instead of the NES versions, I wouldn't have been mad. I'd be mad if all I had was 2600 versions and I knew these other ones existed, that's for sure. But I do think the best home console experience goes to the NES for being a better overall presentation and representation of the arcade feel. Now, the 7800 ports are cool collector's items, fun for Atari or Donkey Kong fans, I suppose, but they just don't feel quite as polished, though still fun. Now, there were other Nintendo-owned games ported to Atari consoles back then, like in the 80s. I'm kind of interested to see how those compare, like things like Popeye, Mario Bros, and Sky Skipper. That could be kind of interesting to check out. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching the video. Appreciate it. Catch you on the next one. Bye.